We're going to start this puppy up. Clear? Prop?
And welcome back to Building the Affordaplane. We're going to resume on our Aileron build right where we left off from last week. So let's get started. And here is our Aileron tube all finished with the rib cutout holes. Make sure you test each one with a sample 1/2-inch rib tube. And now we are ready to align this up with the wing spar and attach the hinges. We are now ready to add the hinges to the aileron spar. First, make sure the aileron spar is 2 inches in from the wing rear spar. Then I have raised the wing spar about 3/4 of an inch to make it easier to work with the hinges. At each of the hinges I have installed a bolt and then the hinge and then a washer. So the washer is keeping these two hinge halves slightly further apart, which will be good when we go to connect the ailerons. It'll give us a little more wiggle room. And notice that I have set it up so that the line on the spar falls underneath the holes. And I have done that simultaneously with all of the hinges. Lined it up. And we can adjust this when we go to drill to make sure we get the line through the holes. So all 4 hinges are in place, ready to be marked and drilled. So as we mark and drill and cleco and rivet these hinges, we can keep the entire spar connected to the wing spar, and that way everything will be lined up properly as we go along. So I'll start from one end and, as we did before, carefully mark, punch, and drill and cleco, keeping things lined up on the line. By not tightening this too much, we can adjust the hinges to compensate for any strange angles that may occur and get these all straightened. So we will begin drilling and clecoing and riveting. And we keep drilling and clecoing. And with the first hinge drilled, you can leave that in place and or rivet, but without disturbing anything, you can move on to the next hinge. And we'll continue on down the line. I've been leaving out the 2 inner ones until I take the bolt off so my riveter nose can get in there and get a good pull. But I have them all completed now. So we'll pull the nut and bolt off and finish up. Then we can test fit with pins instead of nuts and bolts. And as a final test with the nuts and bolts out, you can try your clevis pins. And if all goes well, they will slip in, and you can check the motion. And also pour out all the rivet stems and filings through the end of your tube, because I'm sure there's a bunch in there. I hear them rattling around. Well, now that we have all our hinges done, we can remove our pins, remove the wing off the table, we're done with that, and then start building the rest of the aileron. We have the holes for the ribs. Now we need to create the ribs and attach them. Now the next step in building the ailerons is to locate a 12-foot half-inch tube, 58 thou wall, and this has got to be 12 feet long, and we're going to put a bend in the end. Let's take a look. Our half-inch tube needs a 90-degree turn, and so I'm going to use a half-inch electrician's bender. Now, I'm not using the other one because this one produces a smaller radius, approximately 6 inches. So, and we want the bend to start as soon as possible, so note that I'm putting the arrow no more than an inch down. In other words, even here, and here's our mark. So I'll bend this up on the floor until we get a 90-degree turn reference to the floor. And here's our 90-degree bend. Now we want 6 inches from the top or the bottom of the tube down to the other end of the tube. So I'm going to end up cutting a little bit off to get my 6 inches. Let us bring back our aileron main spar, and with the hinges facing forward, we'll lay it parallel with our long 12-foot half-inch tube. Let's go look at the other end. We want to insert our bent end into our last rib hole, and we want to push it till it just starts coming out the other side. And you'll notice it's just peeking out here. Don't want to go much further, but this way we know that the tube is supported by the main tube all the way around, but going any further doesn't add any strength, and we don't want to see anything more. So with the two tubes parallel to each other, we're going to continue now and create ribs at each of our rib holes that we previously created. And if we measured properly, it should be 6 inches from the back end of this to the top end of this. Because this is half-inch, each rib should be 5.5 inches. That would allow us to push it through the hole to the back side and then stop butted up against this tube. So I'm going to create a 5.5-inch tube, test fit it, and then we can continue creating those 5.5-inch tubes out of the same half-inch tube stock all the way down the row. Next, we want to create a 5.5-inch long half-inch tube. And once we cut this to length, we simply insert it into our next rib location. And remember, we just want it to just start to come out the back, no further. And then check its length. It should butt up right like this rather nicely. If this fits nice, then continue to cut these to the same length, 5.5 inches, for the rest of your rib locations. Later we'll come back and create a gusset to connect this together. And we can also prop this up with a shim to keep it level because this is a little bit higher than the surface. And at the very first rib, we want to trim off the excess here. Just strike a line and pull this away and cut this off here. Now here's one option for making our connection point between these two 1/2-inch tubes. So we got 7 of these ribs to attach to the back spar. And one solution is to make this strip. Now this is 2.5 inches long by 1/2 inch wide, and a little more than 1/4 from the edge I put an 1/8 inch hole, and then at the very center I put an 1/8 inch hole. And the idea here is that it's going to be wrapped around this tube. Now to make a nice wrap, I'm going to take this over to a little jig for bending. My jig consists simply of a 1/2 inch tube in a vise. What I want to do is put the center, which is where my hole is located here, on the tube and simply press down equally on both sides. So that I form a U that's basically at the halfway point of where the center hole is. Now let's take this back to our rib. So now I can set this underneath, and this hole is on the side of our spar tube, and we're going to bend this down, and the idea is to center this properly and then drill a hole through there, cleco and rivet, and then the same thing with the hole over here going into the side. Then we can flip this whole thing over and catch the same rib on the other side. Now another alternative is to create a small triangular gusset. And this is 1.5 inches across the bottom and 1.5 inches straight up from the tip down. So these legs are a little bit longer than the base. And the idea here is that we attach it this way with 2 rivets into the spar and 1 rivet into the rib. And then we would flip it over and use another one on the other side. There are different ways to attach compared to what we had before. What's nice about this way is that all your drilling is straight down, a little more able to control, as opposed to the one hole that needs to be pushed in sideways, and also getting a nice round attachment. So you have either way to do it. This ends up using more rivets, but again it goes down flat. Your choice. I opted for the triangular gusset, and at the very end had a right angle gusset. So with all of these gussets completed, our job now is to flip this over and install on the other side. And then we're practically done. Practically. Making these gussets is pretty easy. I'm using a piece of, I think this one is 25 thousandths. You can use 25 thousandths aluminum sheet. and then just draw out your pattern. In my case, I had 1.5 inches at the bottom and the top and drew some lines. And if you want a nice smooth cut, a pair of shears like this is advantageous because it doesn't leave the little ripple teeth marks and it doesn't curl your material as you cut, which normal aviation shears do. And these are available at all fine aviation outlets. These are Malco, M-A-L-C-O. They're pretty popular with replaceable blades. Our next step is to affix the ribs to the main aileron spar. Now we know that the rib passes through to the back, and we want to make sure that it is sticking through just about like this. In other words, almost flush, maybe protruding just a hair beyond, but we don't need to go any further than that. This way the rib has full contact with the walls of the hole and is offering the full strength. We can use a hammer to tap this out if we need to, or tap it back the other way if necessary. Now we want to draw a line, find the center line of the rib as it goes through, and then we also want the very top. And at this location we're going to use our center punch to make a dimple and then drill through with an 8-inch hole. Our goal then is to send a rivet down of appropriate length so that the top will be the top of our spar, and then we'll catch the first wall. We're going to drill through the first wall of the rib, and the rivet will catch that first wall and then pull it tight to the top, and that prevents the rib from being able to pull out or push in any further. And I'm using a stainless steel rivet. Now let's take a look at the hole inside. And there you notice we have our rivet in the exact place we want it. Now we'll continue this for the rest of the way down the aileron, including our end here, and always setting the rib to the proper length before we drill to make sure it's just right. So notice we can leave this as is, or we could sand it down. It's not really bothering anything just to leave it the way it is. When calculating the grip length of the rivets we are using for this, it's pretty straightforward. We know the diameter of our tube here, 1.1 inches, so half of that would put us here, but we're going back up a half of our 1/2-inch tube and then adding back in the wall thickness because the rivet needs to go past the wall. And if you put all those numbers together, I came up with 0.370 for a grip length. So a rivet that can hold 0.370 should work just fine there. And that generally concludes the construction of the aileron. Of course, eventually we need to create a second one, which is going to be nearly identical for the other wing. And then later, of course, we'll have to cover it with fabric. And actually, our next step will be to create a horn wrong end here. There we go. We want a horn that will fit onto this 1-inch section here. And that would officially complete construction of the aileron. With the ailerons done, now, next time, we can move back to the wing. Are you ready for some rib bending? Back to building. See you next week.